Hey guys, today I want to answer a question that I get asked quite frequently when I'm asked about what I do, and that is, what is ecology? Now surprisingly, a lot of people aren't actually familiar with what ecology really is. I get a lot of people saying like, oh, you do ecology? So like digging up fossils and stuff? I'm like, no, that's archaeology. So yeah, today I'm going to answer that question, what is ecology and why it's beneficial to know what it is. So, in simple terms, ecology is the branch of science that studies the natural world. An ecologist is someone who looks at the relationships and interactions between different species, and from that they determine how these species relate to one another and how they depend on one another for either benefit or survival. So one of the core concepts in ecology is a term called interdependence, which, like the name says, basically means two or more species that depend upon each other for their survival. A similar term that has the same meaning but refers to more specific cases is symbiosis. Now, sym means together, biosis means living, so symbiosis means living together. Interdependence is basically the principle of species living together for some kind of mutual necessity. The most well-known and easiest to illustrate example of symbiosis is the bee and the flower. So obviously bees rely on flowers for the nectar they produce. Bees go to the flowers, they drink the nectar, they go back to their hive and they make honey. But flowers also rely on bees for pollination. When a bee lands on a flower, the tiny little hairs on its body rub against the stamen, which is the male part of the flower, and they collect pollen. The pollen gets trapped in their fur, and then when they fly to another flower, since flowers are both male and female, they have both parts, then when the bee lands on another flower, it deposits that pollen into the carpel, which is the female part, and that pollinates the flower can then produce seeds and reproduce. So that's just one very easy and clear to see example of what interdependence is and how it's omnipresent throughout nature. Every species depends on another in one way or another. For example, we humans, the best example is trees. We obviously breathe oxygen, which the trees produce, and the trees breathe carbon dioxide, which we produce as a byproduct of oxygenation. And we also have symbiotic relationships with other species that we're less aware of. For example, within our own body, we have trillions and trillions of microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, all sorts of things that live inside us. You might have heard of the microbiome or our mitochondria, things like that. We live in symbiosis with these, countless microorganisms within us, without whom we wouldn't be able to survive, and certainly without us, they wouldn't be around. So we are an ecosystem of ourselves. So what ecology really is looking at the natural world and trying to find the pathways through which the whole of nature maintains balance. Obviously, you might have heard of the phrase, the balance of nature or the harmony of nature. And so ecology is the study of the interactions which uphold that harmony in the natural world. And really there's no end to it. I mean, we cannot ever know for sure the full extent of ecological interactions in the world. For example, just in this one twig here, this is a twig which came from this tree behind me, I'm guessing, and it's fallen off and it's landed on the soil. Now, as it lands on the soil, it's going to start to decompose. So what that basically means is different bacteria, insects and fungi are going to start to eat the wood because the wood is full of energy. That's then going to seep into the soil and that's going to provide nutrients for other plants to grow. Obviously this one twig won't do a whole lot, but in a woodland like this where there's twigs and dead trees and branches everywhere, then there's just no end to the recycling of nutrients. And obviously the main source is from dead leaves, fallen leaves. Even standing dead trees can be a host to millions and millions of different organisms. I think a living oak tree can be the habitat for something like 90 million different species. I could be wrong. There's a crow up there. And I believe a dead oak tree can be something like 10 times that, nearly 1 billion different species in just the one tree. But like I said, there's really no end to the different interactions that sustain the natural world. And you know, ecology can be a bit of a tricky subject, because whereas other sciences obviously try to break down processes into sort of structured and linear cause and effect, in ecology there's just no end to the cycles of interactions between abiotic and biotic components. So biotic components are the living things that make up an ecosystem, and the abiotic components are the non-living aspects, like the climate, the landscape, you know, the weather patterns, the humidity, all things like that. And basically these two forces always work together. And what ecology reveals about the world to us is really fascinating. And this is what the whole field of nature conservation, and especially the new sort of rewilding movement, is all based on this principle of co-evolution between living and non-living aspects of an environment. And so what ecology reveals about the nature of our lives is that we are pushed around, so to speak, by the abiotic forces of our environment, which would influence sort of the evolution of our species, or any species, through natural selection. However, what's fascinating is that the species in an environment also shape the environment. They create the environment. One really easy example, like I just mentioned, is this tree here is dropping leaves on the ground. These leaves are going to decompose into the soil, feed its roots, and then the tree is going to be able to regrow. It's creating the soil in which it lives. And you know, that is the whole idea of a habitat, is that a species will either find somewhere or create somewhere that it is able to live. And we humans are very good at doing that, and that's why it's important to understand sort of these broader ecological principles, because we can begin to look at our lives in not so much of an anthropocentric way, and see that we are like most other organisms. In fact, we are a keystone species in the web of life on Earth. And we are very good ecosystem engineers, like beavers, who just by collecting twigs and building a dam can completely change a landscape downstream of the river. There will be floodplains, wetland habitats, bogs, and this will all come from the beaver just building that dam, and that will provide habitat for hundreds of thousands of different species that wouldn't be there otherwise. For example, one of the best stories of rewilding success was in Yellowstone National Park in America. Now, this is quite a famous story. The US government basically commissioned hunters to remove wolves in Yellowstone to make it more tourist friendly. However, after a few decades or so, ecologists started to notice that the ecosystem of Yellowstone was beginning to collapse. And so they told the government, basically, what's happened is you've removed the apex predator of Yellowstone. That causes what's called a trophic cascade, which basically means a ripple effect through the food chain, which influences the entire ecosystem, essentially. To illustrate it more clearly, basically, without the presence of wolves, that means there were more deer and elk and moose and, you know, that sort of range of species who weren't being hunted by wolves anymore. So they overpopulated, and since they're browsers, they browse very heavily on the soil. Then what happened was there were less trees growing. Now, less trees growing meant that there were less young trees for beavers to cut down, because beavers always go for the thinner ones. Obviously they can't go for a monster like that one behind me. They go for the little shoots that are just coming through, so they chomp those down, use them to build their dams. And like I just said, without the dams there, that's hundreds of thousands. Oh, there's a deer right next to me. Hello. There you go, look at that. I can do all sorts of talking, but there will never be a lesson as great as showing you the reality of nature. You're looking right at me. Now don't mind all the dead twigs and branches behind the deer. That is rhododendron, which I've been cutting down, which I'll have another video coming out soon on, or it might already be out depending on when I upload this one. But this one deer here is interdependent with most other species in this woodland. Now I know I just said I was cutting down the rhododendrons, and I'll explain why in another video. But that deer is in a symbiotic relationship with those rhododendrons, although they're an invasive species and I do need to remove them on my land to protect the rest of the woodland. The deer depends on the rhododendron for, shelter and habitat. The rhododendron could depend on the deer for a number of things. One thing is just feces, just pooping on the ground and restoring nutrients into the soil, which the rhododendrons will obviously use to grow. The rhododendrons are also habitat to a number of different insects, and I don't think the deer eat the rhododendron, but they do depend on all sorts of other grasses and leaves around. Just gone down into the valley. So basically what I was saying is that, you can have these top-down effects of an ecosystem, but in reality the whole thing is like a web. You remove any part and it will affect the rest. Even if you remove just, one, like a common one is people say wasps have no place on Earth. Every other species has some kind of ecological role to play, whereas wasps are just pests. That's not true at all. It just means that their sort of ecological, their position in the web of life is just harder to notice than a bee, for example. But then when we look at our own lives and we see how we affect the world around us, if we were to take a step back and look at ourselves as just another keystone species, like wolves, like beavers, like any number of keystone species around the world, we'll see that we, like all of those, have this drastic effect on the world around us, and that we cause this cycle of coevolution, which all species do. The difference is, however, we can recognise when our own actions can be unsustainable and out of balance with the rest of the natural world. And so because we have the intelligence to recognise that, then we also have the responsibility to know what to do and how to act better. So for example, a city is really no different than like a beehive or like a termite mound or anything like that. When you really get down to it, both are just two different organisms accruing matter from the world around them to create their own habitat. And so when you start to look at ourselves in that way, you realise we are no different than any other species on this earth. And yet we have this feeling that we are. And in a way that can sort of lead us on this downward spiral of feeling separate from the world and therefore acting to cause more harm against it. For example, a good example I use is, imagine a parasite infects something like a cow. Now, the parasite is just doing what its nature is to do. The parasite will infect the cow, it will spread and reproduce, and it will slowly eat the insides of the cow. Now, the parasite doesn't know that it is killing its host, and that when its host dies, it will die too. But the difference is we can see that we are perhaps harming our host, which is the rest of the world, the natural world around us. We can recognize that the patterns of cause and effect that happen when we do something like cut down a tree. Just one tree, and then the devastation it can have. So ecology is the science that informs nature conservation, and it also informs nature restoration. There's a little bit of a difference there. Conservation is sort of preserving what exists already, but due to a thing called shifting baseline syndrome, which is basically where each generation has a new sort of base standard for what they believe nature to be, or what they basically believe to be normal, the normal state of nature. That changes with each generation, you know. Growing up, I sort of thought, okay, rolling English countryside, that's beautiful. It's a shame when they build a town on it. But 1,000 years ago, it would have been, you know, oh look, beautiful forest and coppice. Oh, it's a shame when they cut that down and turn it into a farm. But then 6,000 years ago, it would have been, wow, look at this beautiful dynamic landscape of mega herbivores and old growth forests and wetlands and all these interacting habitats and ecosystems, this mosaic of a landscape. So ecology is really sort of understanding the dynamics of nature to understand not only what we need to protect, but also perhaps what needs restoring. And so here in my woodland, for example, I am doing my best to protect it. And in doing so, that is going to also restore some areas. And so that's why I think ecology is really important to understand. And I also think ecology, I personally think that ecology should be a subject taught more in schools, especially sort of the older levels of school. You know, we're taught a lot about maths and all sorts of subjects that may or may not be of use to us in later life, but ecology is one that is always going to be of use to us and can really benefit ourselves and the world around us. I think it's a shame that more people don't understand the beautiful science of ecology. There are so many joys to be had from just sitting and observing the natural world. You don't even have to be a scientist. You know, it's not to say that we need to stop building towns or cities or anything. It just means that we need to first understand the dynamics of the landscape that we want to live in. We then need to work to restore and protect those landscapes. And then we need to find the best way to integrate our own activities into that landscape sustainably so that we're not causing harm to other species, so that we can live there as well as all the other species around us. And so, yeah, I just wanted to answer that question. That was probably not the most straightforward answer, but at the end of the day, ecology is the science that deals with understanding how nature maintains harmony. And it can be a very enlightening subject to study, and it can also be quite depressing at times. I don't know if that helicopter above my head right now is causing any sound issues, but if it is, then I do apologise. Lost my train of thought now. Anyway, thank you for watching. I do enjoy making these little sort of sitting down and talking videos. As time goes on, I think I'll get more used to talking to a camera and perhaps having something more straightforward to say instead of like an octopus going off on all different tangents. But for now, I hope that cleared up the question that some of you may have. If you look at my videos and think, what is ecology? Is it some sort of pseudoscience, or, you know, what's he talking about? I hope this cleared that up, and I hope you can, just from this one little video, maybe start to see different things in the landscapes that you may not notice before. You start to see how different species interact with each other. Yeah. Anyway, thank you for watching. like I said, sorry for the offbeat rants, but I'm glad we got that deer in the video. That was cool, wasn't it? I was just sat here talking about deer. I looked over there and there was just one staring right at me. I wish you all happiness, health and peace. And until the next time, thank you for watching The Wellstead.